Europe, from India, and typically our viewership for these webinars goes as far as Singapore and not Hong Kong, because everyone is asleep in Hong Kong at this time. I'm Ashutosh Varshney, Director of the Center for Contemporary South Asia here at Brown, and it's a pleasure to host this event. Ram Guha's prolific writing career has a new edition, Rebels Against the Raj, Western Fighters for India's Freedom, published by Alfred Knopf here in the US, I think a month ago. It chronicles the story of 7 remarkable people who fought on behalf of India against British rule, 4 from Britain, 2 from the United States, and 1 from Ireland. 4 were men and 3 were women. These 7, Ram Guha's chosen 7, do not remarkably include the famous Anglican priest, Charlie Andrews, who built bridges between the Raj and the freedom movement, especially Mahatma Gandhi. They also do not include Dalrymple's white Mughals, who came to India from foreign lands, but sought Mughal luxury. All 7, to quote him, endured poverty and hardship, disease and incarceration, unquote. They sought ordinary lives. They embraced imprisonment also. Ram Guha is a historian and a biographer based in Bangalore, and he's joining us from there. Among his many books are, I will just note my favorites, The Unquiet Woods, India After Gandhi, and the 2-volume biography of Mahatma Gandhi. Engaging him in a conversation about the new book is my colleague Leela Gandhi, also on the screen, a literary and cultural theorist and John Hawkes Professor of Humanities and English here at Brown, and also currently the director of our Pembroke Center. The Common Cause is among her latest books, in which she examines the lives of those dissenters in Britain in the first half of the 20th century who, to quote Amanda Anderson, a colleague of ours, lived ordinary lives, making themselves less rather than more, making themselves less rather than more. So we have a scholar of self-reduction, perhaps self-deprivation in Britain, who will have a conversation with a scholar of self-deprivation in British India. That's how this is set up. The format is as follows. Leela will introduce the book beyond what I have said briefly. Then the conversation with Ram will proceed around 9 to 10 topics that Leela has chosen. And then we'll follow up with Q&A. And your questions should come via chat, which I'll be monitoring. So I'll try to include as many questions from the chat as possible. Of course, the webinar will end at 11:30 Eastern Standard Time in the United States. So we have an hour and a half to discuss and to ask questions of Ram. I will go off the video now and hand you over to Leela. Leela.
Thank you so much, Ashu. Just a few prefatory words, adding to your description. It's absolutely my incredible privilege to join this conversation with Ramachandra Guha on the topic of his amazing new book, Rebels Against the Raj. I have said this to him, I literally couldn't put it down. It's a masterpiece of intricately plotted narrative history and historical biography, and yet another work that augments Ram Guha's unparalleled, textured, evolving portrait of colonial and post-colonial South Asia. Just a few minutes to add a little more to Ashu's beautiful introduction. This book, a group biography, though so much more than that, of 7 individuals, some better known than others. Annie Besant, B.G. Horniman, Samuel, later Satyanand Stokes, Madeline Slade, later Mira Ben, Philip Spratt, Richard Ralph Keaton, and Catherine Mary Heilman, later Sarla Ben. 4 of these characters are British, 2 American, 1 Irish, 4 men, 3 women, some married, some single, and at least one of them, Ram suggests, is queer or gay. These intersecting lives, and the timeline of this book is exquisite. It spans nearly a century, and it's bookended, at least to my mind, by 2 notable events. The 1893 Chicago World Parliament of Religions, on the one side, famous for Vivekananda's speech about religious tolerance and ecumenism, and on the other, the 1975 Indian state of emergency, called by the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. Of this event, Ram has said memorably in an essay he published in The Hindu some 20 years ago, I think, Indian democracy took an extended leave of absence. Though all of the 7 lives in this book are different and distinct, all the characters are by Ram Guha's account in some way magnetized by Gandhi. And all of them arrived in India to join the anti-colonial struggle against the British colonial regime as rebels against the Raj. So to begin, Ram, this trope of rebelling against one's own culture for the sake of another, at the heart of your book is, of course, extremely salient now as we watch courageous Russian protesters against Putin's war on the Ukraine. You're very precise about what such rebellion entails. You say bridge building isn't enough, temporary solidarity isn't enough. All your characters make a home of India. And you know, they recall Veria Elvin from your exquisite 1999 book, Savaging the Civilized, though he doesn't make this list either. So what draws you so much to this process of throwing over the world in which one is born for a world one has found? I mean, of going native in that discredited term.
Yes. So Leela, you mentioned my biography of Elvin. And this book actually has its genesis in that biography, because it was while working on Elvin that I got fascinated and intrigued by this phenomenon of Western men and women coming over to India and making a home here and taking different routes, some spiritual, some social, some political, some technological, and immersing themselves in Indian life. And that phenomenon, which I call the other side of the Raj, which you've also written about in your writings, has intrigued and fascinated me. But when I wanted to, in a sense, focus the book, I thought rather than this be too diffuse, rather than it go all over the place, become a general kind of anecdotal history of encounters of many Westerners with India, let me introduce a boundary condition, that they should be arrested or deported. And in a sense, this was also linked to my work on Elvin, Leela, because one of Elvin's abiding regrets was that he was never arrested. Unlike his friend Miraben, Madeline Slade, to whom he was very close, he felt envious of her for having gone to prison along with Gandhi in the freedom movement. So it was just a way of sharpening the focus, and making the project manageable. And also, I should say it's not completely exhaustive. There's 7 characters, as you mentioned, whom I profile in this book. There are 4 who appear in the epilogue as getting an honorable mention because I wasn't able to get enough new rich material on them. And I think I'm glad you mentioned the historical arc, 1893 to the 1970s, because it's a century of tumultuous, complicated history in which these lives make their mark, starting with the year that actually not Vivekananda goes to Chicago and Gandhi goes to Durban. In that year, Annie Besant arrives in Madras, right up till times I myself remember. And of course, I didn't know any of these people, but several of them were active while I was a college student during the emergency and after. Sarla Devi was someone who inspired the Chipko movement in the 70s and the 80s. So it's a kind of a century-long arc through which, and these lives are a prism through which one can map, understand, interpret, reflect on Indian history through this century.
Huh. Thank you, Ram. I very much like the idea of a boundary condition. I hope later we can talk about your writing process, because this is such a writerly book, as your writings tend to be. So if I could just talk about a couple of these throw you out on a couple of these boundary conditions. You mentioned incarceration, and so did Ashu in his introduction. It's a very important factor, a prerequisite for the rebellion that makes it into your book. All of your characters, pretty much without exception, spent significant amount of time in colonial prisons. And as you tell this story, I was struck by the realization of just how chronic the threat of incarceration is in a colonial regime. That, your characters are constantly being deported. Their volition and will is constantly being arrested, literally.
Yes.
So such regimes are arguably, in a way, I just realized, cultures of emergency. At the same time, prison and jail time is not just a negative thing in this book, because it's a crucible for Gandhian politics. I mean, of course, Gandhi has so much to say about the ideal prisoner who must transform the jail authorities. Elwin, inspired by this sort of momentum, regrets not going to prison. So it's a very complex account about incarceration. I'd love to draw you out on it.
Yeah, so several were incarcerated for long periods. Miraben most of all, because she is the closest to Gandhi, and she's imprisoned in the Salt March in 1930s. She's alone, she's away from Gandhi. And then, of course, a much longer period of incarceration in the Aga Khan Palace, which is Gandhi's last period in prison, in either a South African or a British prison. Almost 2 years in which, of course, Gandhi's beloved secretary, Mahadev Desai, and his wife of 60 years, Kasturba, died. So that's a kind of, so in a sense, Meera is sharing her feeling of being stifled and confined in a jail with the person she'd most like to be, which is Gandhi, most of the time. But the others are kind of all over the place. Stokes is in Lahore, and he writes, and Stokes lived in Himachal, which up beyond the Shimla hills in a taluk called Kotgarh, at about 7,000 feet, with a kind of alpine climate. And here he is in Lahore jail in the summer with mosquitoes, really upset about it, but somehow soldiering through. Sarla Ben, who was also in the hills in Uttarakhand, is sent out of spite to a jail in the plains.
Wow.
Her first term is in a hill jail, which is bearable. And the English magistrate says, "How dare an English woman rebel against the Raj? I'm going to send you to Lucknow so that you suffer more." So I think it's, of course, this kind of vindictiveness is not unknown in post-colonial regimes either, whether in India or elsewhere. I mean, there's a famous story of the emergency where Indira Gandhi jailed Maharani Gayatri Devi, a princess, and put her in the worst jail, actually near some prisoners with mental health conditions who would shriek all through the night. Right. So sometimes when you have control over the levers of power and you really want to get after those you feel have whose protest has angered you the most, you want to send them as Sarla Ben was sent to a prison in Lucknow rather than carrying on in Almora, which at least weather-wise would have been fine. So I think incarceration and deportation. So 2 of the people were deported. 5 were incarcerated for varying periods of time. 2 were deported, Honeyman and Kaitan, and who were sent back to America. And in some ways, Leela, I just wonder. In some ways, deportation may be worse because you're arrested in India. You exchange life in a village for life in a jail, but you're still with the people you've identified with. Here, in the case of Honeyman, you see yourself as a man of Bombay, as an Indian journalist editing an Indian newspaper allied with the freedom struggle, and you have to spend 7 years in exile. And he's so desperate to come back. The kind of petitions he gets signed by people like H.G. Wells and George Bernard Shaw. He goes on and on. And finally, he adopts a process of subterfuge and illegally lands up, on the Madras coast. And the British can't then deport him. And this is why I wonder about Hahnemann. Obviously, he was in love with Mumbai. He identified with the freedom struggle. But was he in love with an Indian? I think that may be part of his motivation. Likewise with Ketan, who is in South India, likes his work very much, has made some close friends, has mentored some remarkable social workers. And then during the Quit India movement, the British deport him back to a small town called Merom in Indiana. And it's only after independence that Rajagopalachari, encourages him to come back. So in some ways, exile, for people like this, exile may be more difficult, for some Indians today who are not allowed to come back to India, because of their political views. Someone just compared Hahnemann in London to Atish Tasir in New York, for example. Yeah. So in some ways, I feel, reflecting on this, deportation may be emotionally harder, physically easier. Obviously, it's nicer to live in the Midwest than in a crummy British colonial jail somewhere in South India. But emotionally, I think at least incarceration solidified, confirmed, consolidated their identification with India. So they felt more Indian by going to jail with Indians. But being picked up and put on a boat and saying to me, go far away and we don't know when you'll come back, may have been harder.
It's so true. It's so true. Another condition, is you're so right. And I also think about, Gandhi is never restricted that sort of freedom of movement between places. He may have spent a lot of time in jail, but he comes and goes from this country to that country all the time. So it's another boundary condition for qualifying for rebellion in the way you describe is much more than the acquisition of language. And you have some of your characters don't speak local languages, but you emphasize, something that I can only call like a commitment to the transformation of the body through factors like dress and diet and comportment. Samuel Stokes, there are all these iconic moments. Stokes sheds Western robes for that of an Indian mendicant. Madeline Slade learns to sit cross-legged. She tries various items of clothing, settles on the ghagra. Everyone, adopts a kind of... So, to what extent do you, it's so attentive, you're so attentive to these moments of biological transformation. To what extent have you got this perspective from your intimate study of Gandhi, for whom politics transformation requires a kind of conversion of the body, a conversion
of course, very much so. And I think that's the ethos that Gandhi sets for himself and for people around him, and people who are inspired by him. And whether they know it or not, or Stokes onwards, Annie Besant comes before Gandhi, she's older than Gandhi, but Stokes onward, the kind of cultural, physiological, sartorial transformation that these people undergo is really, really inspired by Gandhi. And in some cases, changing their names, becoming Satyanand, right, becoming Meera, becoming Sarla, all of this is part of that process of, I don't like the word indigenization, but maybe identification, transgression. And I think Gandhi sets the tone. And it's interesting, of course, who stays apart. I think, your question is very interesting. I'm just thinking about who stays apart in this list of 7. I think the 2 people who stay apart, at least when it comes to dress and at least superficial outward comportment, Leela, are Hahnemann and Spratt. Okay, they both continue to wear Western dress. And I wonder whether that's because they are journalists and writers of an fierce independence of mind and don't want to be swayed completely by Gandhi. I think it's a mark of their, you could say, their self-reliance that they don't wear Indian dress. As independent-minded writers and editors, it's your question that has sparked this reflection, and I wish we'd had this conversation before I wrote my book. I could have added a couple of paragraphs on this. that Horniman and Spratt never remotely considered taking an Indian name, or indeed taking it to dress, or indeed adopting vegetarian food habits. I mean, there's an anecdote about Spratt which will amuse you, because it's kind of linked to your own family background, which is when Spratt moves to Madras to join Rajagopalachari in Swarajya. He's allotted a flat in a apartment called Kalki Gardens, named after a famous writer who was close to Rajaji, and essentially a Tambram ghetto. And Spratt likes meat. Spratt likes meat. And, Spratt is married to a non-Brahmin. He's married to a Chettiar. So his wife and children also like meat. And there are these smells that waft across to the Spratt kitchen, to the surrounding Tamil Brahmin households. And there's some murmurs of protest. And then Spratt goes somewhere else and rents a house outside Kalki Gardens while continuing to work with Swarajya, editing Swarajya. So I think Spratt and Horniman were, in a sense, not just rebels against the Raj, but rebels against the Gandhian disciplinarian ethos too, in some ways. Yeah. And maybe as writers, writers tend to be independent and, can't be captured, so to say.
True. And Horniman, again, in your amazing portrait, is a man of style. He likes good life. And I think the Gandhian attire.
He likes ballet, he likes art, he likes music, he likes to dress well. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you, Ram. And of course, another question which was on my mind throughout as I read the book is, and in a recent interview, I think you mentioned that you were really pleased that 3 of your 7 subjects were women, since your previous biological subjects have all been male. Now, these 3, Annie Besant, though you've written of women in these other studies of, the sort of extreme sensitivity, but Annie Besant, Madeline Slade, Meera, Catherine Heilman, Sarla Devi, I have many questions about this writing about women. Of course, one is, what were the challenges and rewards for you as a biographer? And of course, the other is, they're all really different women. And not all of them are gender progressive. I mean, Annie Besant certainly does not like women. Sarla Devi is amazing. Campaigns for women in the Uttarakhand Himalaya, you say, extremely conservative place when it comes to the rights of women. Meera is just such a wonderful biography, Ram. You portray her so sensitively as someone who struggles with her own sexuality, from being a die-hard celibate. She scolds Devdas Gandhi for falling in love with Rajagopalachari's daughter Lakshmi. And then she falls into unrequited love with an Indian man, and Bapu is her confidant. I mean, so just to start there.
So I think, Leela, this was certainly for me new and exciting and challenging to write about women, in a sense, as independent subjects. I mean, women are featured in my other books, but they've been secondary. Elwyn's 2 wives, Gandhi, Kasturba, Gandhi's secretary, remarkable secretary in South Africa, Sonia Schlesing. But they've never been really fleshed out. And they've been written about, even if you're kind to say I wrote about them with sympathy and understanding, but even if some of that is there, they're always secondary to the main character whom they are associated with and often serve. And I really enjoyed writing about these 3 women because I'd never actually remotely done anything of this kind before. Even in my early work on peasants, it's mostly male peasant protesters whose traces are in the archives. It is very rare to find women in conservative peasant societies leave their traces in the colonial archive for the historian to discover. So, and they were all very different. I think Annie Besant was a force of nature. She was
amazing,
absolutely full of certitude about and extraordinary energy, constantly reinventing herself. But at the age of in her 60s, late 60s, to abandon theosophy and start a home rule movement. I mean, that kind of certitude is required for activists often. Meera, as you and I think Sarla in some ways is the most endearing because you mentioned earlier on that not all my subjects learned Indian languages adequately, but Sarla did. I mean, she spoke Hindi, and as I say, there's a story of how she stumbles on the hillside and she says, "Baap re baap." He doesn't say, "Oh my God." Instinctively. And she writes her books in Hindi, and then she writes in Hindi and then translates it herself into English, So, and nurturing these women activists in the most backward patriarchal part of India. In fact, one of the happiest moments in my research was to go to Kausani, where she set up the ashram, and talk to Radha Behan, who was her successor, who joined the ashram as a 16-year-old and is now 88 and still very active, actually, in social and public causes. The first woman to be head of the Gandhi Peace Foundation, among other things. So that was in fact, I suppose in some ways I'm an old school biographer in that I don't put my research journeys into the book, but some of the things. But going to Kausani or going to the Christian hospital where Ketan died and discovering his papers in a cupboard were also part of the excitement.
Oh my God.
I think Sarla Ben going to Kausani, because Kausani is also a place where Gandhi revised his commentary on the Gita in 1929. So it has a place in Gandhian law too. And it's a beautiful place, Leela. If you've not been, or anyone listening to this conversation, Kausani has the best views of the snows in the Uttarakhand Himalaya.
Wow.
Absolutely the best views of the snows. It's also the hometown of the great Hindi poet Subhitra Nandan Pant, many of whose poems are about actually snow-clad mountains. And on top of this hill is this women's school which Sarla Devi set up in 1946, which is still active. And it's wonderful to go there and see these young kids, learning, listening, singing, playing, spinning, farming, and so on and so forth. So her spirit is still alive. I think several of these people, their legacies endure. I think some, of course, Stokes is certainly well remembered in Himachal. His promotion of apple cultivation sustains the economy of Himachal still. Some have disappeared. I think Horniman, by the way, I'll just end with this. Horniman, sadly, is largely forgotten in his native Bombay. There's a circle named after him, which is in South Bombay. It's a beautiful circle opposite the Asiatic Society with some nice Gothic buildings around it and lots of trees in the park. But two Mumbaikars in their 70s, distinguished Mumbaikars, one a retired judge and one a writer, a journalist, read my book and said they always thought Horniman was a Parsi. Nariman, Horniman, and half the things in Bombay are named after Parsis. anyway, and they were gobsmacked to find he was this radical, freewheeling, possibly gay journalist. So some of them, I think, have been unjustly forgotten. Others, like Annie Besant, live on in the institutions they founded.
Ram, so just to stay with this question of gender, of course, all of these three women enjoyed surprising freedoms and privileges. Now, those are, of course, a function of race and class. The Mem Sahab is an intractable figure in colonial, post-colonial India. But how much of, in a micro level, how much of the kind of freedom they took for granted had to do with their access to the way in which Gandhi thought of women? They were all of, Meera is very close to Gandhi, and I'm just interested in what he made available to his women associates. By way of a kind of a standard to which gender norms are impertinent in some way, his own gender fluidity. There's something exceptional there that, you've thought about for a very long time.
So absolutely, I think Gandhi, Gandhi is someone whom, superficially, of course, a feminist would not warm to Gandhi. He's ambivalent about women in the workplace. He has bizarre ideas about celibacy and sex. But in other ways, historically, he's enabling. Women come into public life, into activism, into building institutions. Indian women, a lot because of Gandhi. I think, yet having said that, I think a certain distance from Gandhi, which Sarla enjoyed, in contrast to Meera, was probably enabling and emancipatory for Sarla. I think Meera was just too close to Gandhi. I think she had a deep and intense engagement with Gandhi. And in her dealings with Indians, male or female, she could be somewhat hierarchical. Because she was so close to Gandhi. When she established her own ashram, young men came to work with her, but they came to serve her. Whereas those who worked with Sarla were really co-workers, collaborators, colleagues. And I think there was this, I think some of Gandhi's magnetism reflected onto Meera because she'd been so close to Gandhi. And she, except for Devdas Gandhi, who in a sense is a kind of, it's controversial to say this, but I see them actually like siblings. I mean, Gandhi never had a daughter, and Devdas and Meera were actually in a sense, not friends, of course, but also kind of a brother-sister kind of relationship, sort of. And actually, she didn't really have Indian friends. And that may have been partly because she was so obsessed with Gandhi, and partly because when she came to start her own ashram and have Indians working with her, they all were kind of deferential towards her. Annie Besant even more so. You talk about Mem Sahib. Annie Besant was called Badi Mem Sahib in North India. And in South India, she was called Peri Amma, which is, big mother, right? No, yeah. So I think Sarla in some ways was able to realize her independence, her forge her own path and her career most substantively, possibly because she came last and the others had prepared the way. That also sometimes is the case, that, the people who battle before you can't really directly challenge patriarchy or prejudice. It's true of the Dalit movement too. Ambedkar had to come after Gandhi and had to be more direct and more confrontational and more radical than Gandhi, not just because he was a Dalit himself, but because he also came after, some of the paths had been opened for him. But it was a real, I'm so glad I wrote this book, partly because I could write about these three women, and flesh them out. Meera, I think, Leela, is purely because of her pivotal role in the freedom struggle, and also afterwards in actually enabling Attenborough's film, probably deserves a biography in herself.
Yes, that's.
I think I've not really. I think a full standalone biography by a younger biographer with more energy than me and more insights into some of the questions you've raised would be great. Possibly even a film called Bapu Ki Beti.
True.
And all the rebellion too that goes into the relationship. Yeah.
I hadn't realized the role she played in Attenborough's film. It's a remarkable story. Yeah. Thank you, Ram. On another note, it's a kind of great profundity on this topic in the book, is that you highlight throughout the book how almost all your subjects partake of something that you describe and is clearly a kind of spiritual politics, and there are many features of this. One is, having a non-instrumental relationship to people and things. The other is this belief that working on yourself in this particular intricate way will make you less parochial, more a custodian of the world. You write a sense of values to be pursued regardless of an individual's background or theatre of enactment, and a beautiful phrase. What, in your view, is the difference between this sort of signatory spiritual politics and the sort of religious politics that we have in contemporary India?
Yeah, I think, again, it's inescapable and almost mandatory that we turn to Gandhi. Because Gandhi was spiritual without being religious in a certain sense. He was not confined by orthodoxy, by customary practice, by what kind of Hindu was Gandhi. He was his own kind of Hindu. He couldn't be slotted into a sect. Ram lived inside his heart. He didn't need a temple for Ram. His Ram was also called Allah. His closest friend was a Christian priest. So I think, and yet he was a profoundly spiritual person who had room late in life also for engagement with atheists. One of my favorite and contributions to the literature on Gandhiana is a little tract by a follower of Gandhi called Gora, G. Ramachandra Rao, called An Atheist with Gandhi. Gora followed Gandhi in, he started an ashram near Vijayawada, where he brought women, promoted women's education, worked to abolish untouchability, promoted khadi, but would not worship, said I'm an atheist. And then Gandhi called him and they had this conversation. And as part of these conversations was actually Gandhi's reversal of his dictum, God is truth, to truth is God, so it was inverted, kind of to incorporate even an atheist point of view. So I think what you say, Leela, kind of this kind of sense that the world is greater than us, than me, the world is greater than me, that the way to truth and, a desirable life is through interpersonal relations, through service, through understanding. In that sense, there is something spiritual about it. And several of them, of course, come from a spiritual background. Stokes and Ketana missionaries who leave the church, but don't reject completely their Christian past. I mean, even when Stokes becomes a Hindu, he thinks of it as a fulfillment of his path rather than a rejection of what he did before. But I think Gandhi opened the way for this kind of engagement with, spirituality and faith, while rejecting dogma and certitude. I think one of Gandhi's greatest inventions was the interfaith prayer meeting. I think that is something which now it's not, without knowing that it comes from Gandhi, Leela, you will find it practiced in the West. You'll find a church in New York having Jewish rabbis and Hindu monks coming and speak from the pulpit occasionally. But for Gandhi, of course, it was a daily business, morning and evening, and interfaith prayer meeting. And I think, in a sense, all these people, I don't think any of them, Spratt may have been a bit of a skeptic. He may have been a bit of an atheist. I can't really say. But the others, I think, again, this is really part of the ethos of the times, which is opposed to, strict demarcation, is opposed to looking at things in terms of conflict, opposition, Hindu versus Muslim, India versus the West. All those oppositions somehow are diluted and in some cases even just, rejected.
Right. So, I mean, that's the kind of one of the capacious ideals that you document throughout the book. And again, I think the Chicago Parliament of Religion stands over it, iconically. Ecumenism, a kind of capaciousness of conscience. When did all of this go out of vogue? I mean, is it possible to put a date to it? Because is it the last decade or so of contemporary?
I think, Leela, I think social media has quite a lot to do with it.
How so?
Because when you're in social media, you only engage virtually with people who confirm your prejudices.
Interesting.
The Trumpians are talking to the Trumpians. The Bernie Sanders followers are talking to the Bernie Sanders followers. And so on and so forth. Hindutva folks are talking among themselves. And there's a kind of a self-selection in whom you follow, whom you engage with. And it's not just serendipitous encounters. You're traveling on a train and you're meeting someone of a different background. You start a conversation. When your conversations are on your phone, I think it orients you in a kind of it puts you in silos. This is just my hunch that social media may have conversation and dialogue, which is what Gandhi practiced all his life, right? And there's an old and still useful book on Gandhi by David Hardiman, where he uses Bakhtin's concept of dialogue to, and not that Gandhi would have read Bakhtin, but but still, I think this kind of thing, Gandhi. So I think, and all of us growing up in India without a smartphone, on the road, in the bus, in the university special, in the train, would strike up conversations with people of very different backgrounds from ourselves. So we didn't really need preaching. We didn't need, to read Gandhi or to listen to Nehru's speeches or, scrutinize the constitution, to understand how to respect difference, to understand difference, to recognize that India was a land of many faiths, many languages, many cuisines, many forms of dress, and above all, many religious traditions. So I think I have a feeling that, again, this is something, this is just a instinctive feeling. It's a speculation. It's not based on any serious research. But social media tends to put you in silos and tends to promote a us versus them kind of feelings, frame of thinking.
You may be right. Counterintuitive though it is, one would think it would widen one's world, but in fact, yeah. I mean, is there a way also that these divisions that are now so familiar to us are, in a sense, intrinsic to Indian nationalism as such, to any nationalism? I'm thinking here, and I just want to share with our viewers a vignette from your book, in the life, about the life of B.G. Horniman. And you describe how in 1926, Horniman conducts a poll for the Indian National Herald to choose, the 10 greatest living Indians. Winners include Gandhi, Tagore, Madan Mohan Malviya, amongst others. And you have this to say: the 10 greatest Indians were all upper caste Hindus, of whom at least 5 were Brahmins. There was only one woman. There was no Muslim and no Christian, Sikh or Parsi either. In 1926. Is it?
It is striking. Yeah, it is striking. I mean, sure. I mean, so maybe this has got a long history. Absolutely. Yeah.
So, of course, we've been talking, about your evocation of the past. You give us a very storied account of the India that was, but you do a couple of other things that few writers do. You give us an account of an India that may have been, of its potential history. One such remarkable potential history is about the emergence and tenure of early communism in India. And it's through the biography of the redoubtable Philip Spratt, who's come up in our conversation, friend of M.N. Roy's, founder member of the Communist Party of India, lead accused in 1929 Meerut conspiracy case. As you tell his story, it's not clear, if I might use this racing metaphor, whether you have a horse in the race or not, because, and I was so reminded of, it's always stayed with me. It's a remarkable story, a critique of bourgeois democracy, proximity of the Russian Revolution. I was struck of a sentence from your book of essays, Anthropologist Among Marxists, where you've written, inside every thinking Indian, there is a Gandhian and a Marxist struggling for supremacy. So I could see that struggle in you as you were telling the story of that.
Thank you for that. In a sense, I do have a horse in the race. And eventually, at least in my case, I think Gandhi wins and Marx loses. I mean, I still think Marx was a great thinker and had some profound insights into modernity and the transformation of industrial society. But Marxists I have less and less time for. And in some ways, I like Spratt because long before me, he was following the same kind of trajectory. So yes, I mean, I did have a horse. I did have a horse in the race. And I could understand the appeal of communism shortly after the Russian Revolution. To young Indians at that time, including the great Bhagat Singh, for example, there was a new dawn. And Gandhi was seen as a slow-moving, incremental, wishy-washy, pussyfooting kind of guy compared to what seemed to have been this dramatic, total transformation that seemed to have taken place in Russia. I must have believed that if Bhagat Singh had lived 10 years, he may not have followed completely Spratt's trajectory, but he would have known more about what was happening in the Soviet Union. So in that sense, I think I was attracted to Spratt for many reasons. Among not just because of my own youthful entanglement with Marxism and communism when I was doing a PhD in Calcutta, but also because of his strong Bangalore connections. I live in Bangalore, and his press, the weekly he edited in Bangalore called Mice India for Mysore, India, was printed in a press behind where I'm talking to you, which is now a used car showroom, by the way. But that's a side of how Bangalore has changed. He patronized a second-hand bookstore called Select Books, which still exists. So he probably, I don't know whether he went to Koshi's Cafe, but very likely he did, because it started in 1950 when he was still around here. So I think Spratt, I hesitate to name any of these 7 people my favorite. I really enjoyed working with all of them. But in some ways, I think because of these personal resonances with kind of journeys I've taken and roads and, crossroads I've encountered myself. Yeah, so I'd say, and the interesting thing about Spratt, again, talking about loyalty and friendship, Leela, here is a man who, as you say, was the first accused in the Meerut conspiracy case.
Yes.
And then many years later, joins Rajaji in the Swatantra Party. But after he dies, his wife writes to his co-conspirator in Meerut, P.C. Joshi, who has still stayed a communist, and says, get my husband a freedom fighter's pension. And P.C. Joshi says, I remember Spratt very well. I taught him Hindi. He introduced me to English literature. He was always like a brother to me. You are my bhabhi, your sister-in-law. And despite our later divergences in ideology, he fought against the Raj, and I will do what I can to get you a freedom fighter's widow's pension, which is actually what he does. So, sometimes this kind of friendship falls early on in the crucible of revolution, can withstand later ideological differences. It's a very moving story of how the aging P.C. Joshi gets Spratt's widow a freedom fighter's pension.
She's a remarkable woman. And the marriage itself it's a very real marriage.
Very much.
Yeah.
And I think, Leela, one of my regrets is not having access to her letters. So he was in jail. He would write to her once a week. Those letters are still in the possession of the family in Bangalore, which they very graciously shared with me. But her letters to him were probably burnt by the jail authorities after he had read them. But even from his letters to her, you get a sense of what a independent-minded and quite remarkable person she was. Yeah.
Remarkable, yeah. So Ram, apart from the story of kind of, the Marxism that might have been, you also give us this much harder thing, a history that could be, and a subjunctive history. And this is invested so surprisingly and wonderfully in the kind of radical ecologism that you foreground in a surprising number of your subjects. I was so struck by this phrase from Miraben. She writes that you cite, the forests of the Himalayas are the guardians of the northern plains, which in their turn are the granary of India. Surely such guardians deserve the utmost care. Now, Ram, needless to say, your work on ecological consciousness has been path-breaking and ahead of its time. I'd love to hear more about your own career-long attunement to ecologism and how it shapes your perspective, even when you're writing about sports. It's always there somehow.
I suppose, the early engagement of a scholar never leaves the scholar. I'm sure you began life as a scholar of Shakespeare. You've done many different things and, wandered in many different directions since, but I'm sure Shakespeare has not left you. And somewhere there's an imprint of your early training as a Shakespeare scholar in whatever you write, however remotely, however distant it may be in theme and subject from your early research. And in that sense, it's like your first love. Your first deep love is your PhD thesis. And I think my book, The Unquiet Woods, has obviously shaped the way I look at materials, analyze it, write. But having said all of that, and moving the discussion away from my my career, when I wrote an environmental history of the Himalaya in the mid-80s, I had no clue about Miraben's work in the Himalaya. No clue. I discovered it much later. I came across a pile of her writings in the Hindustan Times really in the 1990s after I had finished my research. And she was absolutely precocious. Her writings, of course, on forests, also on on not just on what the destruction of forests would do to floods and increasing of floods, but also the composition of the forest, the transformation of oak to pine and the environmental impacts of that. And today I was sent in my inbox, 2 hours before our conversation, Leela, I was sent in my inbox the abstract of a paper by one of our very fine scientific ecologists, Ghazala Shahabuddin. And her work has been on declining bird diversity in the Himalaya because pine has replaced oak.
Wow.
So I think Mirabai was absolutely precocious. Her warnings against the excessive use of chemical fertilizer, her empathy for those displaced by large dams, which she talks to Nehru about. So Meera, Sarla, who inspires the Chipko movement, and Ketan in South India, who's kind of a proponent of appropriate technology, and very much in the spirit of E.F. Schumacher's "Small is Beautiful." So these three are really precocious ecologists, and yes, I mean, I think they're going against the grain of Nehru's India, where it's all about large dams, steel mills, urban industrial concentrations, a cult of big science, which is kind of pervades the intellectual and policy-making atmosphere. And in a sense, these three are rebels, having been rebels against the British Raj, they're now rebels against the kind of industrialized at all cost kind of thinking that is so common in the 50s and the 60s. Yeah, absolutely. And when I did my environmental research in the 80s and 90s, I had no clue about these pioneers. So I was in a sense, I'm tracing a full circle, and through their work coming back to my early interests.
What led you? I mean, I know this is a side question, as they say, but I can't resist. What led you to this? Because it wasn't in vogue, but you were determined.
It was just pure luck. It was pure luck. It was someone who told me. It was just complete luck. It was not, it was just, I was in Calcutta. I'll tell you, Leela, it was complete luck. I was in Calcutta, and the good fortune of meeting 2 or 3 remarkable older scholars. I was in Calcutta doing a PhD in sociology. I hadn't decided my research topic, and a visiting scholar from Bangalore called Jayanta Bandyopadhyay came, and when I told him I was searching for a topic and he found out I was born and raised in Dehradun, he said, the Chipko movement has taken place just there, and only journalists have written about it, and why don't you do a sociological study? And then, since you're encouraging this kind of anecdotage, I'll go on. Then I go to Delhi, and I go to the Delhi School Library, and I meet this extraordinary figure whom you may have encountered when you were in Delhi, called Shiv Vishwanathan.
Of course.
And he says, "You're interested in ecology?" He takes me to the Ratan Tata Library, and he takes out 4 books: Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, Barry Commoner's Closing Circle, and a collection called Notes for the Future. And he says, "Read this." And I take the 3 books to my hostel room, and my mind opens, So it's really these kinds of encounters. Then I go into the field and meet the Chipko leaders, particularly Chandi Prasad Bhatt, and I'm deeply moved by his courage, his sacrifice, his austerity, his commitment, his understanding, and his immersion in village social work, including with women. And then it carries on from that. So it's really the good fortune of having these encounters with people who oriented me in the right direction.
That's wonderful, Ram. Thank you for sharing that. How do you write, Ram? I mean, this book, as I sat down to read it, I thought, is it going to be 7 short biographies? But oh no, it's nothing like that. It's a complex timeline. You have second innings, and then a third part. The characters move in and out. It's I was mesmerized by the structure of it. There must have been so much information. How do you write? So how do you write a book like this?
So this is, again, it was a challenge, because if you're writing a biography of one person, it's a clear narrative arc. It's birth to death and the different episodes, incidents. You broadly approach them and document them chronologically, not strictly, but broadly. Here there were 7 lives, and I didn't want 7 discrete parts. I wanted to interweave them, to show the ebb and flow, and leave one person at a particular time, move on to the next, and then come back and inevitably there was a cricketing metaphor which you've noticed, the second innings of the Ornament, because the cricket is just one sport in which you get a second innings. So yes, so and there was quite a lot more, and it was about 50,000 words longer, and a lot of it was really quotations that said the same thing in different words in their voices. So with a good editor, I was able to cut all of that out. But I really enjoyed writing this book, Leela, because I think it was a return to my work on Elwyn. Writing on Gandhi is a different kind of challenge. This is in some ways more fun. More fun. This is Thumri compared to Khayal, or Drupad. Yeah. Drupad. This is Thumri compared to Drupad. So it's more fun. Or it's like they were saying Carnatic music tukadas. It's different tukadas. So it was, and I really enjoyed writing this book. I mean, working on Gandhi was laborious. It was difficult. ये वहाँ मजा आया, खूब मजा आया।
हाँ, गांधी पर लिखने में मजा इतना नहीं आता, दिल लग जाता है, मगर मजा तो जरूर आता है। किसने कहा? Who are there any writers, any plotists in particular whom you admire? Your go-to, this is your night. What's on your nightstand, Ram Guha?
I read lots of stuff, Leela. I read lots of stuff, and I don't have really. I think I also said this in a recent conversation. Again, if there are some young scholars listening, I think it's important to have half a dozen or a dozen mentors and exemplars, not one, not one. And that's true. That's true even in your university. Yeah. Don't attach yourself too much to your dissertation supervisor. You'll become a pale shadow of that person, especially if they're as brilliant and charismatic as Leela Gandhi. Don't become a total chela of Leela Gandhi. Learn from Leela Gandhi, but talk to other people in Brown as well. Right?
No, don't say that.
I just read very widely, eclectically, and learn from all of them. Yeah.
That's so. That's very good advice, Ram. Actually, you are absolutely right. Now, just one final kind of literature wala question. That as I read these biographies and their interweaving, I got it was a kind of humanizing thing, such a wonderful sense of the variety in a lifespan. You mentioned Annie Besant starting Home Rule at 60. So many of your characters, notably so many of the women, have this innings again in their 60s. It was so heartening. I just would love to hear you just free associate about, what life lessons you've learned as a biographer, because clearly life starts again and again and again and again and again.
I must say I'm daunted. I am soon to turn 64, और मैं थक गया हूँ. I can't work hard anymore. And I think of these people. Meera leaves India in 1959 when she's 67 and makes a new career in Austria, listening to Beethoven, writing about Gandhi, writing an unreadable, unpublishable book about Beethoven, which as an act of goodwill is published by Gandhians in Madurai of all places. But she's obsessed by it. Sarla in her 70s is doing Bhudan work. Annie Besant is starting the Home Rule League. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. I mean, this capacity to go on and on and on. I think they're very driven people, and often driven by great idealism and the desire to, change things. Yeah, I mean, I honestly am tired at 64. So I can write about them, but I can't remotely. I mean, I'm in awe of what they're able to do at this age. Yeah.
But you talk about that. You chronicle the frailty of the body. Sarla Devi's body hurts. So Meera's body hurts. But then, notwithstanding that, there is this second innings. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Ram, I think we are nearly at 11. So it's just been so amazing to have this conversation. It's such a joy.
I enjoyed it also so much, Leela. Thank you.
And so I think we'll call Ashu and start collecting questions. I'm sure Ashu himself has
Yes.
questions.
Thank you.
Ash,
Thank
over
you.
to you.
This was just to read out one comment that has come, which I think reflects my view as well. Here is Prerna Singh. What a mind-opening, heartwarming conversation. Thank you, Ram and Leela. That's, I want to repeat that. Okay. The more questions coming in, I will pick them up. But let me start with mine. Now, very striking thing in your description of Miraben is her attraction to Beethoven.
Yeah.
And now you added something which I haven't been able to read very minutely. Maybe you did say somewhere in the book that as she returns to Austria, she writes a book on Beethoven. But this generates a curiosity of a profound sort, I think, which is what would be the hypothesis for Miraben's huge attraction to Beethoven and huge attraction to Mahatma Gandhi? What unites the two?
Yeah, so I'll answer that. But first, just a footnote on her attraction to Beethoven.
Yeah.
It's itself an act of rebellion, Ashu and Leela, because after the First World War, German music was anathema in England.
Right.
So for a British pianist to say, I will make a career playing Beethoven was not likely to win many fans. Now, again, I talked about the accidents in my life, and all of us have accidents, happy accidents and coincidences in each of our lives. And in Mira's case, because she admired Beethoven, she went to meet the French writer Romain Rolland, who was an expert on Beethoven and who had just published a biography of Beethoven. And while discussing that book with Romain Rolland, he told her, my next book is on Gandhi, and she had never heard of Gandhi. And then when that book was published, she picked it up and transferred her allegiances almost overnight from Beethoven to Gandhi. So it was really this meeting of Romain Rolland that occasioned this shift.
Okay, and here is another question. So they're all attracted to Gandhi, and they come and live simple lives. In many cases, they give up on the luxuries they had. But even the simpler lives of the West would be much more comfortable than the simple lives of India at the time. Now, it seems to me it's not just Gandhi's life as depicted in Romain Rolland, which became a fascination for a lot of them. But there's also Gandhi's view about India as a nation, it seems to me, might play a role. So in Hind Swaraj, this is what Gandhi, remember that as you know it better than most people, Hind Swaraj. But in this conversation, when he's asked, should the British be expelled from India after independence, and I cite, he says, it is not necessary for us to have as our goal the expulsion of the English. If the English become Indianized, we can accommodate them. They just shouldn't be our rulers, right? So there is a view of nationhood here, which is not ethnic, which is not religious, which is a very capacious view of nationhood. India can accommodate anyone who's willing to respect Indian culture, and can come from anywhere.
So that's, and again, I'd like to suggest that it's very much there in Gandhi, and it's there in Gandhi's mentor Gokhale, and it's also there in the only Indian Gandhi really recognized as his moral equal, who was Rabindranath Tagore. All of them had that sense that, anyone who can come, identify with us, work with us, engage with us, and we will learn from them. So, and since it's not come up so far in the conversation, I'd like to highlight for those who are part of the program today that this book on foreigners who became Indians is dedicated to Jean Drèze,
who is one himself.
He was a living example himself, and who's more Indian in his understanding of how ordinary Indians live, in his ability to converse in Hindi and Hindustani, in the arduous train and bus journeys he makes all over India than most of us. So, he may have a white skin, but that's completely accidental.
Okay, so now some questions from the chat room. Gautam Piduri asked the following. Thanks so much for this conversation. I would like to ask about a perhaps counter ethos to what has been talked about so far. I think of a very different sort of Westerner, the esoteric Hindu Nazi Julia Portes, who changed her name to Savitri Devi and was a virulent vegetarian, ecologist, anti-vivisectionist, but also a believer that Hitler was an avatar of Vishnu and that India could teach the world the best form of racial segregation via its caste system. Would it be fair to say that the self-transformation of the yogi might also go in the direction of fascism just as much it can go towards Gandhi?
I certainly. I mean, people engage with countries in different ways. Absolutely. I mean, that can certainly happen. And Savitri Devi is an example of someone who took a very different path. And in that sense, this returns us to Gandhi. It's Gandhi who enables this kind of constructive, empathetic, mutually beneficial engagement between the West and India. So yes, absolutely, it can certainly go in a different direction.
Would you just reminds me of one more thing? Would you be able to say something about Aurobindo and Srima? Is there something important to say there as we talk about those who?
I think Leela would be the best person to answer. I'd love to hear Leela's views on this.
Okay, let's have Leela comment on that question.
On how Ashu would you?
On Aurobindo and the mother, and how that and of course, yeah.
Well, there are many ways of telling that story, and I think the story of Mira Alfasa is not as well known. It's remarkable. It's complex. It's because it's a story that comes from France, not from Britain, and those parts are less known in our historical imagination. I mean, she is a remarkable dissident, an intellectual dissident, a political dissident. I mean, when she comes to the Pondicherry ashram, there's nothing there. Sri Aurobindo is described by as in Peter Heese's amazing biographies of Sri Aurobindo as the most dangerous man in India. He's run away from British India, and this person, this French Jewish Algerian woman, comes to start to join his ashram. They are also intellectually very interesting. They are collaborators. She gets citizenship in the 70s. It's a complex story, and really one that will require us to look for material for outside of Britain, interactions from other parts. I could go on. It's one of my favorite stories of the kind of theme that Ram is chronicling in his book.
Okay. Here is another question for you, Ram. This is about Sister Nivedita. I have found that you have mentioned Sister Nivedita among the honorary Westerners who played a part against the actions of both government and the Hindu dogmas. But according to you, why? But she doesn't get a place in your book in detail. By the way, I'm not disrespecting your view. I'm simply curious why she has disappeared from your recent book.
Yeah, so she's mentioned again. These are choices authors have to make to have a certain focus, a sharpness of so that it doesn't go all over the place. And the two I really regret leaving out to Sister Nivedita and Charlie Andrews. Charlie Andrews is a particular favorite of mine because he was so close to Tagore and to Gandhi, and was an extraordinary figure. I mean, the work he did for the emancipation of indentured labor in places like Guyana and Fiji and so on, inspired by Gandhi, was quite extraordinary. But eventually I decided only to include those people who had been arrested or deported. But to your questioner about Sister Nivedita, I've now begun some work returning to my early environmental interests, where she figures in a very interesting way. There was some of you might know of a Scottish town planner called Patrick Geddes, who had an ecological approach to the city and who wanted to blend the city and the countryside, really, in redesigning settlements. And he was inspired by Sister Nivedita to come to India, where he wrote many forgotten town plans, which I hope to write about now. So people like Sister Nivedita, Mira Alfalza, and others inspired many interesting lines of thought and argument. But I really felt she didn't have a place in this book. Another person I was sorry to leave out was Margaret Cousins, who started the All India Women's Conference, and I had to leave her out too, So I think one has to make choices of that kind, and which is not to say other people shouldn't flesh out their lives and their legacies in richer detail. I mean, think about every work of history is that it's incomplete, interim, it's an invitation to an argument. Yeah. Hopefully to a constructive argument which leads to further and deeper scholarship. So, yeah.
You say that you didn't include Charlie Andrews because he didn't go to jail. Sister Nivedita, she didn't go to jail. No, she didn't go to jail. So that's another reason you could. You could leave her out of the domain of analysis.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Now, Neelam Srivastav. Thank you for this fantastic conversation, Professor Guha. I was wondering if you felt there were analogies between the figures you explore in your book and other anti-colonial activists in later and geographically diverse contexts.
Yes.
I'm struck by Professor Leela Gandhi's use of the term self-othering in relationship to metropolitan sympathizers with anti-imperialist movements. In particular, I was then thinking of Frantz Fanon, who dies in Algerian, and Sylvia Pankhurst, who dies in Ethiopia, having defended Ethiopia against the Italian invasion in 1935. Do you have some thoughts on Fanon and Pankhurst?
Yes, they'll certainly be part of this constellation. I actually make a comparison in my book, in the epilogue, where I compare the Westerners who joined the Indian freedom struggle with white South Africans who rebelled against apartheid, who betrayed their race in a similar way, renegades, dissenters, rather than benefit from the racial system, which as privileged whites, they could be part of and enjoy. People like Joe Slovo, Ruth First,
Nadine Gardiner too, the novelist. Nadine Gardiner, the novelist.
Nadine Gardiner was more a bridge builder than a renegade, but she was more a bridge. But out there too, they were bridge builders and they were rebels and renegades. So I think they are a really interesting group of people. I think Albie Sachs, who lost an arm, who was in a bomb blast, and then went on to be a member of the South African Constitutional Court after Mandela became president. I think they're an extraordinary group. Also, again, they are briefly mentioned in my book, the Lincoln Brigade of Americans who fought in the Spanish Civil War on the side of the Republicans. Sylvia Pankhurst for sure, Frantz Fanon, absolutely. All these people are part of the same, you could say, biradari, if I may use that term, the same biradari as the rebels of my book. Yeah. The same fraternity.
Prerna Singh is very struck by your dedication to Jean Drèze. And she says, perhaps we can visualize him as a rebel against the Hindu nationalist Raj. That might be an interesting. If someone wrote a biography of Jean, then perhaps that would be the title, A Rebel Against Hindu Nationalist Raj.
Yes, probably,
But she says, I had a question about the counterfactuals or potential histories, the term that you've used. Looking at the present, it's notable that in the list, looking at the present in particular, it's notable in the list of the top 10 Indians that you mentioned in the 1920s, there is Madan Mohan Malviya. And there's also a Gandhian and a Marxist there. Is Malviya recognized as a Hindu nationalist at that time or not?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, this is a time when you could be both a member of the Hindu Mahasabha and the Congress. So he is recognized as a Hindu nationalist. I think he's admired then for having founded the Banaras Hindu University and for his scholarship. I think that's really he's a acharya. That's how he's seen. He's seen as a teacher. And that's how he's admired. Yeah. One thing, if I may say about Jean Drèze, and if I make a revelation, not a confession. This book, Leela and Ashu, was originally titled Renegades.
I see.
So it carried the title Renegades for the last 15 years. And so it was called Renegades. The subtitle is the same, Western Fighters for India's Freedom. And the dedication read, for Jean Drèze, a renegade of our time. Okay. However, 6 months ago, Barack Obama and Bruce Springsteen decided to publish a book with the title Renegades.
Yes.
So I had to look, I was not going to compete with them. So I had to look for another title. So it became Rebels Against the Raj, which was fine, which was evocative enough and descriptive, an accurate description of what the book is about. But I was sorry to change the dedication, because I couldn't say a rebel of our time, but a renegade of our time would have made more sense. Yes, I think Jean will hopefully get his own biography one day soon. I don't know how cooperative he'll be. Yeah, he's a very, as you know, very elusive, reclusive kind of chap. I mean, if I may use an idiom from your native land, Ashu, thoda sanki aadmi hai. He's very admirable, but also a bit odd, So,
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so here is another question. This is from Arkabrata Bera. I'm not sure where. Maybe India, maybe America, maybe further beyond. Most of the time, we find that the Westerners who were involved in the movement against caste were, of course, drawn to Gandhi or were passive in nature. I think the idea here is passivity. I mean, passivity, of course, Gandhi resisted the term passive, at least in his later years.
Yes.
Do we find Westerners who were part of a more aggressive movement in India or believed in violent overthrow of the British?
Not to my knowledge, but I haven't come across them, but it's possible. I mean, I don't know any Westerners who, I mean, they were the odd, of course, the communists, yes. I mean, Philip Spratt, and along with Philip Spratt, there were two other communists in the Meerut conspiracy, British communists in the Meerut conspiracy case called Bradley and Hutchinson, if memory serves. And they clearly believed in violent revolution, but they would have been very few, really. Yeah.
But and Bhagat Singh obviously is not a source of attraction at the time because he's very young and he's
very young.
And
yeah.
when he's executed, how old was he? He was 23 years old, so he still had to get a following. I mean, he became larger than life after his execution.
Absolutely,
right?
And with every succeeding year after his death, he's more and more important.
And now he's an iconic figure for Aam Aadmi Party.
Yeah.
The two portraits that the Aam Aadmi Party chief minister in Punjab has in his office are Ambedkar and Bhagat Singh. Very interesting combination.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Those are the okay. So here is Manan Bhatt. What parallels and or contradictions you would draw between Swami Vivekananda and M.K. Gandhi, both of whom play such important roles for you, and in particular about their views of women?
That's a very large and complicated question, and I haven't studied it seriously enough to answer. And I'm not really a Vivekananda scholar. I should say that I, of course, know a little bit about him, and I'm intrigued and admired much of what he's done, but I haven't really studied him in any depth, so I can't really answer that.
Was there anything Vivekananda said about Gandhi? Or he died before Gandhi became prominent, right?
Yeah, and Gandhi goes to Belur but doesn't meet him. He goes there but doesn't meet him. Interestingly, these are the very interesting aspects of these lives. There's no reason for Vivekananda to know of Gandhi because Vivekananda died, I think, in 1901.
Yes.
And Gandhi was just a minor activist in South Africa at that time.
Right.
But Vivekananda and Tagore lived in the same town. Both were very influential. Tagore, by the 1890s, was already a major Bengali writer.
Right.
But they really were ships that passed each other in the night, and they never referred to one another. And they only meet once in the home of the American Consul General in Calcutta. That's very interesting. But there is an interesting Gandhi-Vivekananda connection, which Leela would also be particularly interested in, which I would briefly mention. Yeah. In my biography, I talk about Gandhi's enchantment with Sarla Devi Chaudharani, who was Tagore's niece, who was a great writer, singer, patriot, whom Gandhi was very besotted with for about a couple of years. And she was close to Vivekananda. She was an extraordinary Indian woman. She deserves a biography of her own. She left home. She decided to study science, which no woman had done in Calcutta before then. She goes to Mysore to become a teacher because she doesn't want to arrange marriage. Then she encounters Vivekananda, and Vivekananda is so struck by her. Vivekananda cooks for her. Vivekananda was, by the way, a great cook who loved cooking non-vegetarian food. Let this be said loud and clear and underlined. Vivekananda was a great non-vegetarian cook. And I wish he was here in Karnataka today with an open kitchen to which all of us could go. So, and in one of those meals which he cooked for Sarla Devi, he told her, "You're so brilliant, you're so beautiful, you're so charismatic, you're a singer, you're a poet. You should preach Hindu Dharma all over the world. I'll send you as my emissary," right? And this is the same woman whom Gandhi was enchanted by 20 years later. So there's an interesting kind of Vivekananda-Gandhi connection there, but it's mostly anecdotal.
Arkabrata Beda again, and he adds here now, by the way, I'm from India, so that's where he's writing from. That's where he's joined the conversation here. He basically wants to know why you've written about so many people here as well as earlier. Why have you never written about revolutionaries?
But the other people to write about revolutionaries. And I'm not a revolutionary. I'm not a revolutionary myself. I believe in reform and incremental change. I'm not a revolutionary. So I can see what inspires people to become revolutionaries. But as a historian of the 20th century, I've seen where revolutions have taken societies. And, I think there may 1,000, 100 flowers bloom and other people can write about it. I'm not attracted by revolutionaries. I think Bhagat Singh was an extraordinary figure. I think because I've read his diaries, and I think he was a man of a wide and capacious interests, and Marxist-Leninist dogma, he would not have been confined by it had he lived another 5 more years. I mean, he was reading all kinds of things. He was reading Adam Smith, he was reading Tolstoy. God knows where he would have gone. But revolutionaries generally don't attract me.
They don't attract you. Okay, so why would you write about them?
Yeah.
When Richard Attenborough was asked by General Zia, now that you made a film on Gandhi, can you make a film on Jinnah? And he said, "No, I'm not attracted to Jinnah. Therefore, I cannot make a film on him." And isn't my view of Jinnah very clear from my work, my film Gandhi?
So let me say that my view of revolutionaries is not as pejorative as Attenborough's view of Gandhi.
Okay. Of Jinnah.
Maybe I don't have that view, but they're not for me. I don't really have that. Yeah.
We have 8 more minutes, and I'm sure there will be more questions here. There are more questions coming, but there is the 2-3 questions here which I was also going to ask. So you have how many women here? You have
3 out of 7.
3 out of 7. Yeah. Gandhi's views about women. I was very struck when I read Gandhi, My Mother, by the niece who went to Noah Khali with him.
Manu Gandhi.
Yeah, Manu, yeah. Gandhi, My Mother, the idea that she was conceptualizing, and then Gandhi, Suzanne Rudolph writing somewhere that at one point towards the last 3-4 years of his life, he says, "I have played so many roles in life, I have never played the mother." And it would be nice to have nice to be able to play this role. And then soon after that I read Manu's Gandhi, My Mother. Now, can you say something about what his views about women have to do with whether these 3 women were attracted to him, or generally? I think you're right to say that at one level Gandhi is an arch feminist. There is no doubt about that argument. I think you're right. He brought out women into the public sphere, and especially during the salt satyagraha. I think it's very clear that the idea, the brilliant, truly brilliant idea of salt was also addressed to those who cook in the kitchen. Why are you paying so much for your salt? And this is, I call it in my class the Tea Party moment in some ways. There is something very remarkably indigenous. And remember, when he goes to the Congress party that I want to start a salt satyagraha, Nehru writes he got a provisional agreement, a provisional approval, because they said Gandhi knows something that we don't. We don't understand the salt business, but he understands something we don't. And lo and behold, within 3 months, all of India was making salt. So it was quite anyway. Now let's return to women. So Salt March did bring out women into the public sphere. So in that sense, Gandhi is a feminist. But feminism is not only about bringing women into the public sphere, right? So what can you say about his view of women and these 3 women that you've chosen, their attraction to him?
So before the Salt March, several years before the Salt March, because of Gandhi, Sarojini Naidu becomes the first Indian woman to be president of the Congress. Annie Besant had been president in 1917, and Gandhi insists that Sarojini Naidu is made president in 1925, at a time when I very much doubt that Providence, Rhode Island had any women in any city council or Democratic or Republican councils at all, right? So he was cognizant of that. At the same time, as I've said in my conversation with Leela, there were limitations to what kind of independence and agency he would give women. He was ambivalent about women working in the workforce. His views on celibacy are hugely problematic for men and for women. But I think in this deeply conservative, hidebound, traditional society, he brought women into public life. And they went on to do different kinds of things. People like Mridula Sarabhai, Subhadra Joshi, Aruna Asif Ali, and above all, my favorite Indian woman, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay. There's a great biography that has just been written, and I'm privileged to get an early copy of the manuscript. It won't be out for a year or a year and a half, by the wonderful young American historian Nico Slate. It's the first high-class biography of Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay. And she comes from the Gandhi Gharana. And she does many things. I mean, she's famous for having revived handicrafts, for having set up the Sangeet Natak Academy. But also, as Nico Slate shows, she carries the Gandhian message of Satyagraha to the American South in the late 30s, long before Martin Luther King. So from the Gandhi Gharana, all kinds of women come. I mean, Ela Bhatt is also from the Gandhi Gharana. She's from Ahmedabad and knows about Gandhi. And then, of course, rebels against the male domination of the Gandhian Labor Union and starts her own self-employed women's association. So in that sense, despite what may appear to be his own occasionally or more than occasionally conservative views about women, he is an enabler of women's emancipation through the lives of people like Kamala Devi and Ela Bhatt and Sarla Ben and Meera Ben and many, many others.
And he doesn't see that as a contradiction.
You see, in a conservative society, you have to go slowly. For example, for the first time, imagine in India, men and women in the 1920s, on the street, on the same ashram, on the same school. It's an incredibly radical act of transgression. So you have to put boundaries. Even his celibacy and his insistence on brahmacharya is partly because of that he doesn't want to scare the parents who are sending their boys and girls out to join the movement. But I think he's always ambivalent about women working. In fact, Rajaji also shares that. I think Nehru and Ambedkar are more thoroughgoing feminists than people like Gandhi and Rajagopalachari.
And what's his objection to women working or ambivalence? What is the opposition?
Essentially, he thinks the major role of a woman is
in the
family and household. Yeah,
raising children.
Yeah, and running the household and carrying forth the home. Yeah.
And just as Kasturba did.
Yes, and maybe of course you not as loyally and submissively as Kasturba did, but generally yes.
Yeah. Let me see if there are any other questions. I thought Arvind was also online. Arvind Subramaniam. Arvind, do you have a question? Oh, Arvind has a question. No, Arvind has a comment. Wonderful event, Ram, Leela, Ashu, thank you. Okay. And another question, when will it be uploaded on YouTube? Very soon, those who want to watch this on YouTube, it was streamed live and we will put it up on our Watson Institute YouTube channel before long, not before long, very, very soon. So it's time now for me as a host to thank Ram and Leela for this conversation, and Ram especially for giving us yet another book in his untiring journey of as a writer. I'm sure there's another book coming very soon. This you said this was born some 25, 30 years ago, the idea?
20 odd years ago, yeah.
So most of the writing was done?
No, the writing was done in the last 2 years, but in these 20 years when I was working on Gandhi and Indian history, I would just collect stuff I found in the archives related to it and file it out. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Ram.
Thank you, Leela.
For joining us at Brown, and thank you, Leela.